Had some bullet points I wanted to bring out about this chapter and how intriguing and how fascinating this chapter is when you stop and really look at the events that transpire here. If you want to date this chapter, somewhere probably around 1760 BC is when these events took place. So you're somewhere around 675 years after the flood. So history is continuing to march on. God's plan is still in motion from Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. You know, when you begin to look at this chapter 27 and you read it, it's got all the makings of a television series, hasn't it? I don't know if you stopped and thought about that, but it's kind of strange to say that. Back when I was a kid, there were things on television, and I have no idea if this even exists anymore, called soap operas. And you had things like Days of Our Lives and As the World Turns, and it was a never-ending saga and drama within those families, okay? It went on and on and on and on and on. I told Mama one time, I said, you could miss 3 months of that and turn it back on, you pick up right where you left off. So anyway, it has all the makings of that, and there's a lot of lessons to learn. And I want to look at some of the intrigue that went on with this. Then we'll probably read through the chapter along and glean some other things out of it. But as I said, it's got all the makings of a drama, of intrigue. One of the things that you begin to see early on before you get into Genesis chapter 27 is in Genesis chapter 25, you see partiality within the family. Partiality between the children and their parents. In Genesis chapter 25 and verse 28, you had Isaac, he loved Esau because Esau was a hunter and man of the field. You could say that in our terminology that a lot of times men are drawn to the ruggedness of their children, aren't they? And you see that a lot of times in families, okay? And yet we find that Rebekah loved Jacob. He was a man of the tents. He was more of a flock tender, if you will, that type of person. Doesn't mean there was anything wrong with Jacob. That's just who he was. That was going to be his, shall you say, vocation in life. We see a birthright being despised, don't we? We see a birthright being despised in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 34. One of the things when you think about these birthrights, you kind of see the same thing playing out in Jacob's life that you did in Isaac's life, that you did in his father's Abraham's life. Remember when we studied about Ishmael being born and Abraham petitioned God on behalf of Ishmael, the firstborn, to get the blessing, and God said no, it's going to be given to Isaac. Well, you see the same thing being played out here, don't you? You find that early on the children were struggling in Rebekah's womb, and God had said that the elder is going to serve the younger. God had a plan because he already knew what was going to transpire in the life of Esau. And so we find this birthright being despised here, Genesis chapter 25 and verse 34. We see a plot to manipulate this thing that was drawn up by man. A plot to manipulate, drawn up by man. To manipulate this thing in Genesis chapter 27 and verses 1 through 17. You see the deception being played out in Genesis chapter 27 verses 18 through 29. You see that by lying we find that Jacob was profaning God. And that's a pretty serious charge, isn't it? But this is what he said when he's questioning, and we'll get to that in Genesis chapter 27 and verse 20. Isaac said unto his son, how is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son? Talking to, he's thinking Esau, but he's actually talking to Jacob, who has deceived him. And how had you found this venison so quickly, my son? And he said, because the Lord thy God hath brought it to me. Well, God didn't know such thing. Rebekah had that done and prepared, didn't she? And so here again, we find that situation going on. In verse 24, we find, art thou my very son Esau? And this is Jacob speaking, I am. So we find these things going on. We find the deception is going to be revealed in Genesis chapter 27, verses 32 to 33. We find one brother, in essence, becoming an outcast, and he had embarked on that road himself, Esau had. That's why he would not receive the birthright in Genesis 27, 39 through 40. And what's real interesting, malice and hatred entered the picture on another scale because Esau was going to kill Jacob. Esau was going to kill Jacob in Genesis chapter 27 and verse 41. And so we can see traits of humanity in this thing, and I want to tie this in with a third party, okay, that very often we don't think about that is in this, okay? Very early on in the history of man, we find siblings rising up against each other and killing each other, don't we? We find enmity between Ishmael and Isaac and the events that transformed there. So we find that these family issues are not unusual in the life of man. But you know what we find overall in this, even though we find all these dramas and all this intrigue and all this plotting going on? God said in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 that the promise was coming. In other words, what we're going to see, even though man is doing what he does, God's will is done in spite of the actions of man. And you take the actions of man and you ask yourself, the question is, man, all this went on in their lives and it's in the Bible. And it's written here. Paul told the church at Rome and the church at Corinth, it's written here for our learning. What we need to learn about this, we may as well saddle up within ourselves. God's will is going to be done, and we may as well accept it and go on and quit trying to run interference. We need to accept it and go on and quit trying to run interference. His will is going to be done. And I said, we're going to bring a third party into this. And it's a party that we don't think about very often as we read these stories and we read these narratives about the lives of these Bible characters. Who do we very often don't think about? The devil. The devil. From Genesis 3:15 till now, and on past now, but we're now today at 1760 BC roughly, what has the devil's plan been? What was his mission and motive? To thwart the plan of God. His mission and motive was not to allow Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 to happen. We find his influence led up to, of course, man being expelled from the Garden of Eden. His influence has led up to man apostatizing greatly and God destroying the earth by water. We find his presence being felt after the flood, early on in the life of men, somewhere around 100 years or so, or thereabouts. You had the Tower of Babel, and you see his presence being felt. So you're steadily seeing the presence of the devil unfold. Let's just lay all this aside. The devil can do and manipulate and try whatever he wants. God's will is going to be done in the end. So very often when we think about these things and we read these things and we study on them, maybe that's an aspect that we forget about. You're dealing with human beings and human frailties, but you're also dealing with the influence of the devil in these things. He's going to have his say, isn't he? Go ahead, Brother John.
We're going to see all of this unfolding here in 27 as we go on down through that. All that's going on between Jacob and Esau and his mother, Rebekah. We're going to see that God prophesied that when he said that in her womb was two nations, and that the elder would serve the younger. And so it had to come to pass, and it would come to pass because it was predicted.
Yeah.
And that's the way I look at the world situation today. All these things that happen have been predicted. You go back there to Matthew 24 and Luke 21, Mark 13, you'll find all the signs of what's going to be happening. We see the destruction of Jerusalem as a type of the end of the world. So we done had the destruction of Jerusalem. We were talking about that on the way up in mid-March. And I said, well, look at here, but we still ain't at the end of the world. But we're seeing what's going on and the way things are shaping up. They got this big deal going, about Putin and Ukraine. I ain't going to mention more about it. Just going to say that it's underway. But he done put his nuclear team on high alert. Now, and that's as of today. And if you know one thing like I know, that's going to be some bloody stuff. And it could be the beginning of the end of the world. Who knows?
Yeah, only Jesus knows when that's going, well, actually, only God knows when that's going to happen.
The day and the hour is
Yeah.
only known by Jesus.
Yeah, when you get over there into that,
But you can look at these scriptures and see, you can look at them and see what happened in the past, and that's when you're learning.
that's where you learn.
Now, that's what we're doing today. We're learning now to listen.
Right.
We're learning to listen.
Right. Learn to
Let
pay.
God's word speak. Let it say what it says.
Right. Yeah. And so there's a lot of thought in this whole thing, Daniel, would you read a few verses for us, please? Verses 1 through, how about verses 1 through 13?
Now it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, My son. And he answered him, And I am. And he said, Behold, now I am old, I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt me, and make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat, that my soul may bless thee before I die. Now Rebekah was listening. Isaac spoke to Esau his son. And Esau went to the field to hunt game. So Rebekah spoke to Jacob his son, saying, Indeed, I heard your father speak to Esau your brother, saying, Bring me game and make savory food that I may eat it, bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me from there 2 choice foods of the day. I will make savory food from them for your father, such as he loves. Then we shall take it to your father, that he may eat it, and that he may bless you before his death. And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Look, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, and I am a sweet man. Perhaps my father will kill me, and I shall seem to be excused, and I shall bring a curse to myself and out of that. But his mother said to him, Let your curse be on you. Only obey my voice, and will get in life.
And so we find the Bible picks up in Genesis chapter 27 with Isaac wanting some tasty venison from the field or from the woods or the roundabout area to eat. And yet what he was going to do, Esau prepared this venison, he was going to go and give him the blessing, wasn't he? And a lot of times with this, when you look at it, as it is laid out as a narrative, it's kind of hard to paraphrase a lot of this because it pretty much stands for itself, doesn't it? The story is what it is. But anyway, we find that he wanted that savory meat. He thought a lot of Esau, as we said before. He loved Esau. And that's not unusual a lot of times within families to where, and it shouldn't be because it does lead to problems. We're going to find that where partiality in families, in Jacob's family, led to a problem, didn't it? What had he done for Joseph? He made him a coat of many colors, didn't he? Well, what did that do to his brothers? Well, that brought about envy, didn't it? So what did that bring about? Well, what that brought about was Joseph being captured more or less by his brothers and sold to an Egyptian caravan. Okay, they're taken into Egypt. And yet, even with that plan, those brothers meant it for evil, didn't they? But what did God do with it? He turned it around and used it for good. And we're going to find later on that Joseph's heart was right in the matter, because being the prime minister of Egypt, which he was at that time, he has not revealed himself to his brothers, and when they finally did, they were afraid. Joseph could have retaliated, and it would have been a different story, wouldn't it? But he didn't, because he knew God had placed him there for a purpose and for a plan. And so we find that Rebekah overheard this and what was going on, and this was an opportunity that she saw to make sure that Jacob would receive the blessing of the birthright. If you look at this thing, really, Esau had already sold the birthright to Jacob for a bowl of food. But it had to be consummated by someone. So we find that Jacob was going to be the one to receive that blessing. Isaac more or less is consummating that blessing to him. He's ensuring that Jacob would receive the blessing, is what he's doing. But anyway, we find that at this point in time, Esau went hunting. He went into the field. Rebekah overheard this. And so while that was going on, she got with the son that she loved. She got with Jacob and said, go fetch me some goats, and I'm going to prepare this food for your daddy. And so he did that. But Jacob was a little bit hesitant about this son. You can see in verse 11, and Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, behold, my brother is hairy, and I am a smooth man. My father peradventure will feel me, and I shall seem to him as a deceiver, and I shall bring a curse upon me and not a blessing. And so, Jacob paused for a few minutes and realized, this may not work. I'm a smooth man and my brother's hairy. Even though my father's eyes are dim, he can still feel with his hands. And so we find that, he was like, we need to think about this thing before we do it. But notice that she was insistent on having that plan carried out. And his mother said unto him, upon me be thy curse, my son, and obey my voice, and go fetch them to me. And so we find Rebekah basically saying to him, maybe like what we hear people say today, don't you worry about that, I'll take responsibility for it, you just go do it. And of course he obeyed his mother, didn't he? He went and done it.
It shows that Jacob kind of hung around in tents, he was probably in the habit of obeying his mother's voice.
Yeah. Most likely, yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Where it says, behold, now I'm old and know not the day of my death. Evidently I must have been teaching in Genesis. This has been years and years ago. And I can't remember, and I don't find my notebook or my notes on it. But I do remember researching it. And he lived he lived 20 more years.
Years after that.
He lived 20 years after he made that
Statement,
after
yeah.
this occasion.
Yeah. Yeah.
He did live. He lived on, although he was blind.
Yeah. Yeah. And you find something very similar, a thought pattern there with Esau and the pottage. I'm going to die. Esau said, I'm so hungry, I'm going to die. Well, in reality, he wasn't going to die. He just didn't think that much. He had, be kind of like today. We'd be out working, and it'd be hot, and be tired, and all that. And somebody show up, and they got one of those big 21-ounce T-bone steaks, tenderly cooked and all like that. And all we can hear is our stomach telling us, eat, eat, eat. All right? So you're following the flesh, aren't you? You're following the flesh is my whole point. And so we find, too, that his eyes had grown dim. And as you get older, that does happen, doesn't it? And as we all can attest to, well, not all of us, some of us are still relatively young, and compared to my age and Brother Con's age, y'all ain't even got started yet. But anyway, with that being said, there's a thought there about your eyes growing dim. You know, we find that that's why it's important for the Word of God to dwell where? In our heart. Okay? There may become a period of time when our eyes are dim that we can't see the Word. And that was one of the things that the Apostle Paul, you know, he cautioned in Acts chapter 8. In Acts chapter 8 in verse, Acts chapter 28. That he said about the children of Israel of old. Well, actually, Isaiah the prophet said it in Acts chapter 28 and verse 25. Well spake the Holy Ghost by Isaiah the prophet unto our fathers, saying, Go unto this people and say, Hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall not see and not perceive. For the heart of this people is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. So we find, you know, taking a look at this, the way Isaac's eyes grew dim, it was a natural process through age. But you know, something's going to happen here that was a tip-off. Even though his eyesight was failed, what was his hearing? Seemed like it was still pretty good. Seemed like it was still pretty good. And so we find that we're going to find that in this narrative in Genesis 27 and 22 that Jacob went near unto his father Isaac, and he felt him and said, The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. You know, with our eyes being dim, we can be blinded, can't we? Many in the religious world are blinded. Just take the voice of Jacob here. He could hear it. Many hear the voice of God. But the wolves are in what? Sheep's clothing. So when they reach out to touch the wolves, they feel like sheep. They're blinded, aren't they? The voice is saying one thing, the flesh is saying what? Another. So anyway, thought that was kind of interesting that we would bring that in there. I'm gonna pause for just a second. Any of you brother, and if you got anything you want to add to that, Jill? Read? Okay. All right. Reed Griffith, would you pick up with verse 14 and read through verse 20 for us, please?
So the man got into his mother made savory food such as his father was. And Rebekah took the best garments of Esau and other sons, which were with her in the house, put them on Jacob the youngest. And she put the skins of young goats on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. She also gave the savory food and the bread which she had made for her son David. And he came to his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am. Who are you, my son? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done his spoil. Get up, please, sit and eat of my hand, that you may love. Isaac said to his son, How is it that you have it good with you? He said, Because the Lord your God caused it to happen.
Okay. And so we find, as we pick up here, that he went, and as Brother Con said, he obeyed his mother's voice, and she made him this savory meat, the savory dish. You know, one of the things that we learned maybe about this savory dish is deception can be pretty, can't it? It can be pretty. You know, normally with deception, it's not played out for what it to be. You know, very often we find, for example, with alcohol commercials on television and things of that nature, it shows the glamour and the glitz and the merrymaking and all that kind of stuff, and how all the in crowd, if you will, and I don't know what the phraseology is today, that was what it was in my day, are doing these things. And so, you know, and yet it don't show the other side of it, the deceptive side of it. It don't show the sick people the next morning, the broke people, rent not being paid, power bills not being paid, people not being able to go into work at risk of losing their jobs. It don't show the children and things of that nature. It just shows the glamorous side of it. And that's the way deception works, isn't it? You know, when people are deceived out of something, that person doing the deception does not look like what he actually is. He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And we probably used this several times, and it really painted the picture in my mind a number of years ago on a movie I was watching. And what it was about, it was on a so-called Christian broadcast network, TBN, and what it showed was a temptation of Jesus. And I think they've done an excellent job on portraying the devil in the mountain scene. There Jesus was in the mountain, and the devil came to him. You know how he came to him? He had that pitchfork and them pointy ears and them eyes on fire and that pointy tail, and he was charging him. Nope. Far from it. Far from it. The devil came to Jesus as a very polished, poetic speaker. He was a man for his times dressed in attire that would show him as a man of some sense of respectability. And I say it like that because that's the deception part of it. His beard was neatly trimmed and clean. And when he spoke, sugar wouldn't melt. Now that's the devil. That's true deception, isn't it? That's really a sheep in wolf's clothing, isn't it? And I thought about that, and that's how he works. And he's not this gory thing that our Hollywood has presented it to be. He's not this red man with the pointy tail that French artists and Italian artists have portrayed him down through the years. He's not that. He's a cunning hunter. He's like a lion, Peter said. You know, a hunter doesn't go in the woods making a bunch of racket and being ugly and things of that nature, does he? How does he go in? Quietly. He blends in. He's patient. Because if you go in any other way, what the deer going to do? He going to run. Somebody come at you with a pitchfork and fiery eyes and a pointy ears and a tail down you, what you going to do? You going to run. But somebody come at you in another manner, very poised, very poetic in speech, very polite. You don't see the harm, do you? You don't see the danger. Go ahead, Brother Tommy.
This is something I know a lot of here have probably heard and may not have ever heard. But a long time ago when I was just a boy growing up in the 30s, somewhere between 7, 8, 10, 12 years old like that, people went out in the woods and went hunting. They went squirrel hunting. So if they went hunting without a dog, they didn't have no dog, they sit down real quiet and watch. Sometimes they catch somebody with them, have them slip around there on the other side and make that squirrel turn around and come on his side. But he always goes up the tree. And he got himself in the tree between you and him, the squirrel, and he's smart. But my point is that when they went hunting like that and didn't have no dog, they just sat down there very quiet and called it. I know it's quiet, but they had a name for it. They called it still hunting.
Still hunting.
Have you ever heard it called still?
Oh yeah, I've been still hunting. Years ago when I was a kid. Yeah.
Still hunting.
I've been still hunting, deer hunting before.
I ain't say that still now, but I ain't talking plain. S-T-I-L-L. Still hunting.
Yeah, yeah.
That's like sitting down there and being still.
Right, right. You don't want to scare the prey off. You want to capture the prey, or in that case, you want to hunt the prey and kill the prey, and then that's what the devil does. That's what he wants. A lot of blindness took place with that savory meat, didn't it? If you stop and think about it, a lot of blindness took place, even though he could hear the voice. And a lot of times that's the way it is in the religious world too. Stop and think about it for just a minute. We hear the voice of God. We know what we're supposed to do. We know what we ought to do. We know what we should do. But this sure looks good over here. I don't see no harm in it. That's deception, isn't it? Deception. The religious world is a master at deception. It portrays one thing, but in reality is another. But anyway, that's what we've got going on here. We've got the effects and works of the devil involved in this thing. This is what we got to hear.
While you're talking about that, I thought about 2 Corinthians 11, 13 and 14. It says, because false apostles seek the word of transforming themselves into false scribes, and no marvel forsake themselves and transform into an angel of light.
Yep.
He
Yep.
laid the groundwork for these false teachers.
Yeah.
Way back in
Oh yeah. This is nothing, really what they're talking about there. Of course, we're in the spiritual world today. It's nothing new about these false teachers. They know what they're doing in their manipulation. Actually, sometimes you have to stop and just wonder if they had put that much effort or half that much effort into studying and carrying out the truth, and all that effort into creating something that's not, been a lot less work on them, wouldn't it? People spend a lot of time to manipulate them. When just go ahead and do what you got to do and be done with it. Ain't gonna need all that manipulation. Anyway, very good. But yeah, he is transformed into, and don't be surprised at his workers. And when the Apostle Paul is looking at that, he's writing that to the church, so he's looking at it like, okay, they're gonna be those in the church like that. They take on all this look and this piousness, but in reality, they're the workers of Satan. And so we find, as we get back to this, that he did eat this. He thought he was dealing with Esau. Should have been a tip-off, as we said earlier in verse 20. Not verse 20, but in verse 27, verse 24, about him hearing the voice. But he didn't. So we're back up here to verse 20, and Isaac said unto him, and this should have been a tip, how was you able to do this so quickly? Now Isaac, his brain was still functioning, okay? Even though his eyes was dim, his hearing still was working. How did you do this so quickly? I mean, you went out, and I know you had to hunt it, and you had to skin it, and you had to prepare it, and you had to cook it, and here you are, you back already. That one of the quickest hunts I've ever seen for in my life. If we went out on a hunt like that, and we wasn't gone but a few minutes, and we come back with something, and especially something grand, somebody gonna ask a question. Well, that didn't take long, did it? It's a tip-off, isn't it? And so we find that now Jacob is going to make the statement when he's asked about that. How'd you do it so quickly, my son? Now he's going to play on Isaac's heart. Well, God provided that, Jack. You've heard people say that? God did that. Well, to Jacob, to Isaac, that was an acceptable answer, because Isaac being old, he could put his faith and trust in God, hadn't he? Huh? Do what now?
He said, your God.
Yeah, because thy God, good point, Jeff. He sure didn't he? I didn't notice that. Yep, he sure did. He said, your God. That's right, that's very good. I didn't even notice that. I've read this thing how many times. So ever learning, Jeff. That's good. He said that thy God brought it into me. And this brings up an interesting point, and it kind of ties in with something I read in one of the commentaries, that there's a thought out there that Jacob wasn't totally convinced about God and God's influence into Genesis chapter 28 and the latter. And this may tie back into that. There's a thought out there on that you're dealing with people here right now in the realm of Jacob. He's in the family of God, but he's not converted, so to speak. Does that make sense, Reed? And so, Jeff, that may tie that in. There may be something to that thought. I'll have to go back and look at that. Because he does say, your God, doesn't He didn't say our God or the God of heaven or what it did. Good thought. That'll give us something to look at when we get to verse, chapter 28, won't it? Very good. Anyway, so he said that, thy God has provided this. Well, what's he saying? God did this. Well, he's playing on Isaac's heart. He's playing on his religion, isn't he? To try to get this thing through. And of course, Isaac said unto Jacob, and I'll just go ahead and take up here because we're going to quit in a few minutes. And Isaac said unto Jacob, come near, I pray thee, that I may feel thee, my son, whether thou be my very son Esau or not. So, there was some suspicion here.
Yeah, he's really suspicious.
The events are not adding up. I hear it, the timing. Hey, something's off here. Remember we said this is like a drama playing out. Okay? And so he comes near, and of course, Isaac feels of him and all like that. And Jacob went near unto Isaac his father. He felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he discerned him not, because his hands were hairy, as his brother's Esau's hands. And so he blessed him. And he said, art thou my very son Esau? Well, he's still suspicious, isn't he? And notice what Jacob's going to say. I am. The plot had gotten so involved and so in depth, there was no turning around, was there? He was in, and now he was in for the long haul. And so we find, he said, bring it near to me, and I will eat of my son's venison. My soul may bless thee. And he brought it near to him, and he did eat, and he brought him wine, and he did drink. And his father Isaac said unto him, come near now, and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his raiment. So his sense of smell was working. His sense of smell was working. And, being dressed like he was, he smelled like Esau. And he blessed him and said, see, the smell of my son is the smell of a field which the Lord had blessed. Therefore give thee of the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and the plenty of corn and wine, and let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee, and be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be every one that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. And it came to pass, as soon as Isaac had made an end to the blessing of Jacob, and Jacob was yet scarce gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, here comes Esau. Here comes Esau. Jacob accomplished and Rebekah accomplished what they set out to do. We find that in these few verses that we have here that we just read, the blessings that the promised seed would come through through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, and through that family has now been transferred officially to Jacob. Even though God had already said there are two nations in thy womb struggling, the elder shall serve the younger. We find that here it's been transferred. And this is going to bring up some other family problems too, and it's time for me to stop. So let me run this much.